Order. Before we begin, I have a few preliminary announcements. Members should send their... Oh yes, sorry, beg your pardon.
Bank Resolution, Recapitalisation Bill, Lords. Sorry
about that. Before we begin, I have a few preliminary announcements. Members should send the speaking notes by email to hansardnotes@parliament.uk, and please switch electronic devices to silent. Tea and coffees are not allowed during sittings. Today we will first consider the programme motion on the amendment paper. We will then consider a motion to enable the reporting of written evidence for publication. I hope you can take these matters formally without debate. I now call on the Minister to move the programme motion standing in their name, which was discussed on Monday by the Programming Subcommittee for this bill.
Formally.
The question is, the programme motion is on the amendment paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. I now call on the Minister to move the motion about written evidence.
Formally.
The question is the motion as on the amendment paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Copies of written evidence which the committee receives will be made available in the committee room and will be circulated to members by email. We will now begin line by line consideration of the bill. The selection and grouping list for today's sitting is available in the room. This shows how the clauses and selected amendments have been grouped together for debate. Amendments and clauses grouped together are generally on a similar issue. Please note that decisions on amendments do not take place in the order they are debated, but in the order they appear on the amendment paper. The selection and grouping list shows the order of debates. Decisions on each amendment and on whether each clause should stand part of the bill are taken when we come to the relevant clause. The Minister is called first. Other members are then free to catch my eye to speak on all or any of the amendments, clauses or the schedule within that group. A member may speak more than once in a single debate. At the end of a debate on a group, I shall call the Minister again. We now come to Government Amendment 1, proposed to Clause 1, with which it will be convenient to debate Amendment 3, proposed to Clause 1. Government Amendment... Speaker. Yeah. Minister, sorry.
Thank you, Ms Jordan. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship for the first time, but I'm sure not the last. But thank you very much. I beg to move Government Amendment 1. This amendment will ensure that the Bank of England has the flexibility to use the mechanism provided in this bill in a broad range of circumstances. It does this by removing the provision added in the other place that prevents the Bank of England from using the new mechanism in relation to firms that have been directed to hold additional loss-absorbing resources, also known as MREL, or Minimum Requirement for Own Funds and Eligible Liabilities. I will also speak to Amendment 3 tabled by the Honourable Gentleman for Wokingham, which aims to ensure that the mechanism is only used for small banks. I appreciate that this is an issue that is of interest to many honourable members in this House as we discuss this at second reading, and also to those in the other place where this was debated. The Government's position on this matter is clear. As I set out at second reading, the intention is for the mechanism in the bill to be used primarily to support the resolution of smaller banks. The Government reaffirmed that position in its draft updates to its Code of Practice, which the Bank of England must have regard to when using its resolution powers, and indeed in the written statement that my predecessor made to the House on the 15th of October last year. The Government appreciates the intent of the amendment passed in the other place, and indeed of the Amendment 3 that we will be debating this afternoon, to preserve flexibility to use the mechanism on firms transitioning towards holding their full allocation of MREL. I also appreciate the remaining key concern that without restricting the scope of the mechanism, the Bank of England could use this mechanism on the largest banks. I should make absolutely clear that that is not the Government's primary policy intention. The Bank of England should always, first and foremost, rely on a firm's own MREL resources, ensuring its shareholders and investors bear the losses rather than turning to this mechanism. However, having considered this matter carefully, the government believes it is still not desirable to limit the mechanism's scope on the face of the bill, because this would effectively hardwire the principle that the mechanism is unavailable for larger banks into legislation, and it is that hardwiring that the government is concerned about. Bank failures, as we have seen and experienced, are highly unpredictable, and the government's concern is that if the legislation is overly restrictive, that might mean that the mechanism is unavailable in the very unlikely circumstances of large bank failures where public funds may still be exposed. And we must remember in this bill, the primary objective is to protect the taxpayer. The government considers it's important that the mechanism's use, therefore, is not overly constrained in the legislation, ensuring it provides comprehensive protection for public funds, i.e. the taxpayer. To explain the government's thinking on this issue in more detail, I'll make 3 points. Firstly, there may be very limited circumstances in which the flexibility to use the mechanism on larger firms would help protect public funds. The largest and most complex firms are required to hold the additional resources to be bailed in, known as MREL, which aims to provide a robust level of self-insurance for large firms. The bill's mechanism can only be used where a firm is transferred to a buyer or a bridge bank upon failure, something that is not envisaged for a large bank, which is expected to be bailed in instead. Taking those points together, large banks should therefore have sufficient own resources to meet their recapitalisation costs, and the mechanism is unlikely to be available for use on large banks, even with the scope in the bill remaining broad. However, it is theoretically possible that circumstances could emerge for which a larger bank is not sufficiently resourced, though I would say that these are highly unlikely. One example is if the firm was subject to a large redress claim resulting in a higher recapitalisation amount than envisaged. Another example would be if the market value of the firm's assets changes over time, that could result in more losses than expected at the point of failure, again resulting in a higher amount of recapitalisation. These examples, however unlikely they may be, show that there is a clear benefit in having the flexibility to source additional resources from the mechanism, having already written down the firm's available MREL. Restricting the scope on the face of the bill would prevent the mechanism being available in these types of scenario, leaving public funds, and therefore the taxpayer, exposed instead. Secondly, I reiterate that the Bank of England would first look to write down or otherwise expose to loss available MREL, and would only then consider use of the mechanism if a sale to a buyer or transfer to a bridge bank were needed. Funds from industry are therefore not expected to be used to cover a large bank's full recapitalisation amount. Instead, they are expected to be needed only for an additional shortfall over and above that which the firm's own resources could fulfil, and once these resources have been written down or exposed to loss. Use of the mechanism would simply be a top-up to achieve recapitalisation, rather than covering all of a firm's recapitalisation costs. Thirdly and finally, the government agrees with the intent behind Amendment 3 in that it is important for there to be sufficient safeguards to prevent any inappropriate use of the new mechanism on large firms. I can reassure the Honourable Member for Wokingham that there are already a range of safeguards in place which the government believes provide the necessary checks and balances. For example, the Treasury is involved in the exercise of any resolution powers through being consulted about whether conditions for resolution have been met. The Treasury would also need to approve any resolution action with implications for public funds. If the Bank of England requested a large sum from the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, which they could not provide through their own resources, this would have implications for public funds, as the Financial Services Compensation Scheme would need to borrow from the Treasury. This means that in practice, Treasury consent would be required if the Bank of England had requested a large sum. The bill also includes some important mechanisms to ensure transparency and parliamentary scrutiny. For example, the bill now requires the Bank of England to report to the Chancellor on the use of the new mechanism and requires the Chancellor to lay these reports in Parliament. And the bill also requires the Bank of England to notify the chairs of the relevant parliamentary committees, namely the Treasury Select Committee and the House of Lords Financial Services Regulation Committee, following use of the mechanism. These measures will ensure that Parliament is able to scrutinise the Bank of England's actions in relation to the new mechanism, and these were added in the debate in the other place to the bill. I hope these explanations go some way to provide reassurance that the government's approach is the right one, that ultimately flexibility in the legislation is better for economic and financial stability and limiting risks to public funds, which is what this bill is all about. As a result, I hope that honourable members are able to support the government's amendment, and I would gratefully ask the honourable member to withdraw his amendment.
Yeah.
Government Amendment 1, proposed to Clause 1 as on the amendment paper. The question is that the amendment be made. Shadow Minister Garnier.
Well, thank you very much, Mrs. Jordan, and it's a great pleasure to speak to serve for the first time under your chairmanship. And can I thank the Minister? So far we're having a fantastic time of agreement, but not on this one, on this particular point. If I may, can I speak to Government Amendment 1 and to the Amendment 2 and 3 from the member for Wokingham. So Government Amendment 1, so this is trying to reverse an amendment that was put into place by those in the other House, proposed by my colleague Baroness Veer. So we refer to this as the Veer Amendment that is trying to be reversed. The Minister made quite a strong and convincing case of why the government or the Bank of England feels that it needs to have this ability to be able to use this type of financial services compensation scheme redress in the case of some of the larger banks. But as I was listening to the Minister's words just now, what worried me was that the Minister was highlighting the fact that the MREL regime could fail. And having spent 3.5 years or so on the Parliamentary Commission for Banking Standards coming up with this stuff in the first place, on the MREL stuff, and also the Treasury Select Committee analysing the banking crisis, of course we completely accept that there is no way that we can possibly legislate for any possible type of failure in the future. But what we can do is try to learn by mistakes. And what is being suggested by the Minister here is one where there is an exception that the MREL regime is not right. And what I would prefer to see is that the MREL regime is looked at again to make sure it operates properly. She makes a very good point, which is that you could have a bank issues an MREL convertible bond, which converts into equity in the event of a default, and that the bank could be a successful bank during the course of its life, and that the MREL bond isn't in fact sufficiently big enough in order to meet the liabilities in the event of a default. So to me, the answer to that is not to try and squeeze another bit of legislation into place that tries to fudge that. What we should be doing is looking more carefully at the MREL regime in order to make sure that the MREL regime is right. Although I do completely understand her point that this regime is only going to make up the top up. But the problem is, if we're going for, the government is going for a growth agenda, and we all know that the City of London, the financial services institution, is something that can grow quite quickly, we could end up with a situation where actually there's quite a lot of money which is being asked by the other banks to bear and support this. So we will vote against this. We'll push this to a division, and we won't agree to it. And I'm glancing towards my Liberal Democrats friends on this side. The enthusiastic nod, I hope, means we won't be by ourselves in this. If I may also speak to the Liberal Democrat amendment, the Amendment 2, I think it is. So this is on the one of actually bringing back, in a slightly different form, the amendment proposed and enacted by Baroness de Vere in the other place. But it does add something else to it, which we're slightly worried about. And again, it comes, as I say, having been on the Parliamentary Commission for Banking Standards looking at this for a number of years, I tend to become quite a purist about this. What worries me about this particular amendment is it restores the fundamental important point, but it does look to have a negative resolution SI in order to make sure that happens. Now, the key point about all of this financial service regulation is that what we don't want to do is to have a situation in the future where we find ourselves crashing into a banking crisis. Now, at the moment, we have a very, very stable parliament. We have a supermajority by the party opposite, which we on this side are doing everything we possibly can to smash. We're going to smash the gangs. But it is something which obviously could change. And I think one of the important points, so I think it's perfectly clear that if we had this situation in Council, that somebody could move a negative resolution SI and it would be defeated instantaneously, so there's no problem. We, however, have to write legislation in terms of making sure we can look at the possibility of what happens in the future. And one of those things that could happen in the future is if these opinion polls are right at the moment, we could have a situation where all three of the major parties, two of the major parties and one insurgent, who sadly isn't here, who isn't represented here today. But we could have a situation where there's no overall party in government. And then you could have a situation where there is 40 days, up to 40 days of uncertainty, waiting for this negative resolution SI to be enacted. And 40 days, I mean, if you look back at why we're here in the first place with the Silicon Valley Bank was causing problems on a Friday afternoon. It was resolved on a Saturday afternoon and sorted out for when people came in on a Monday morning. Imagine if we have 40 days where there is the slightest bit of uncertainty. So we're 100% behind the spirit of the substantive part of the Liberal Democrat amendment, but because of that element of insecurity and possible insecurity in the future, it doesn't give confidence to the financial services sector and the banking sector. So we will have to reject that one. However, Liberal Democrats will be delighted to hear that we will their growth agenda is an incredibly good idea. I suspect the Minister may want to make the point that you don't need to have a growth agenda in this type of bill. But I think it's something important. We support, actually, I think everybody supports the idea that we should have growth in our economy, and there are lots of things we can do. So I think there's no harm in supporting this and debating it. I think there are a number of things, though, that we need to think about in terms of our banking sector and our financial services sector. And there are a number of things which, if I may, use this opportunity to perhaps make some suggestions to the Minister, that we can have a think about in terms of how we can try to promote growth. One of the there are a number of different things which we've been looking at, which create problems for challenger banks, and one of those is the starting point of the MREL regime. The starting point starts to cut in at a balance sheet of 15 billion and is fully executed at a balance sheet of 20 billion. This was set in 2016. A lot of the challenger banks, or they're not the challenger banks, they're now running decent-sized businesses, but they're coming up to that situation where they have a hard buffer which they have to get over. So would the Minister, with her officials, go and have a think about modifying, and I know there's a plan to do this in 2027, but to modify the MREL regime where we can increase that buffer to something in the region of 35 to 40 billion pounds to reflect the fact that we've had a reasonable amount of inflation since 2016, and that there is a different banking market, so to increase the size of that. Similarly, there are a lot of other issues which are facing all financial services institutions within the regulations of the Prudential Regulatory Authority. And I understand that we're talking here about a threshold. I understand in the rule book that the PRA operates, there are 50 thresholds for banks to look at. So if a bank's compliance department and the accounts department are looking at 50 different thresholds, that is quite a confusing picture. And again, if the Minister would be able to have a look at simplifying the rules under which our financial services regime operates. 50 thresholds seems dare I say it, 49 thresholds too many, but I can completely accept that there may be a handful, but 50 does seem rather complicated. I think that probably covers it for me. As I say, we will be supporting the Liberal Democrats number 3 amendment. But as I say, just to summarise, I think this is a fundamentally good bill. This gets back to the ideal behind the Parliamentary Commission of Banking Standards, which started a lot of this process. At the end of the day, financial services regulation has to be dynamic. Things change quite a lot, and we have to, at every stage, be predicting for the unknown that's going to happen in the future. I use a terrible analogy, but it's rather like the Titanic, which was built to be unsinkable, but by having separate watertight compartments in it. As it turned out, the watertight compartments weren't big enough, but the spirit behind it is, when things go wrong, you learn from that, you make the watertight compartments higher. So there's a lot of things to learn from this, but I think this whole bill is a very good move forward. But as I say, we can't support the government on getting rid of these MREL limits. We can't support the Liberal Democrats on their first because of the uncertainty of that 40-day negative resolution side. But crackerjack on the growth agenda, which we wholeheartedly support, which is, and hopefully the government will as well. Thank you very much for your time.
Chris Cobble.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the Honourable Gentleman for his remarks and for supporting our Amendment 3. Chair, we're proposing Amendment 3 because the Minister, when the bill was introduced, spoke about the bill enhancing the resolution regime in response to the failure of small banks. And we believe that is appropriate, and we want, and we're not, I guess it's an assessment of risk between mission creep in terms of if you allow this mechanism to apply to larger banks, a risk of unnecessary costs falling on banks versus, as the Minister says, having an additional mechanism available in the event of a bank failure. And what I'd say on that is, I guess, a few things. Firstly, if the MREL of a bank, if that capital is exhausted, then frankly you're probably looking at a public bailout in any case. I'm sceptical whether the additional mechanisms in this bill would absolve the taxpayer from needing to bail out the bank. So it would seem to me that the risk of the Bank of England going beyond the intention of this bill in terms of imposing additional costs on banks are higher than that. And the Honourable Gentleman is right in terms of the need for speed. So I should declare that I was a hedge fund manager during the Lehman collapse in 2008. I didn't cause it. But I saw how fast it happened, and secondly, the consequences of actually not bailing out Lehman were far worse than had the US government bailed it out. And it certainly begs the question to me, why 16 years later are we looking at this mechanism for being an effective device for preventing banking collapses when there was a whole raft of reforms in 2009 through to 2012, which the evidence would suggest at least have been effective in that we haven't had any bank failures, as far as I'm aware, in the UK since that date. So for those reasons, we are tabling Amendment 3. But I think, to the Honourable Gentleman's point, the government might be better served by doing a full review of the banking regulation in the UK overall, at assessing whether it is indeed effective in preventing the risk of a banking collapse, rather than tacking on small mechanisms beyond the intention of an existing bill. And for that reason, we will be pushing the amendment to a vote. Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank both honourable gentlemen for their contributions. Let me turn to the honourable gentleman's last point, and I think the Honourable the Shadow Minister's first point, which is that the government continues to have confidence in the regime for managing the failure of larger, more complex banks, and that the bail-in regime remains the right strategy for such firms, ensuring that a firm's state shareholders and investors, rather than taxpayers, are on the hook if they fail. And the Honourable Gentleman asked why we're doing this now. Well, the reason we're doing this now is firstly because the lot opposite started it, and we agree with them. No, put it more formally, Ms. Doddin, the previous government started down this track of reviewing what happened with Silicon Valley Bank. So they looked, rightly, in our view, at what happened over that weekend, and the Shadow Minister has mentioned this, at what happened in the case of Silicon Valley Bank. And I think the case of Silicon Valley Bank shows us a couple of things, and we were keen to learn lessons from this. Firstly, that the resolution regime works pretty well, but that we were fortunate that Silicon Valley Bank was an attractive proposition to HSBC, and therefore, in the end, although these things are never easy, and there were officials from Treasury and the bank who worked all weekend, and ministers who were involved. One of whom's now a shadow minister, one of whom's on the back benches and on the opposition benches. If SVB hadn't been an attractive proposition, then things might have been different. And this is to protect the taxpayer in that scenario. So we're not wishing to throw it all the pieces up in the air and see where they land. We're not doing a wholesale reform of the resolution regime. This is an important, but in the scheme of things, a relatively minor tweak to what is a much broader regime for to deal with these circumstances. I hope that reassures the honourable gentleman. We note that he had nothing to do with the global financial crash. And coming to the amendment, I'm a little bit confused by the Shadow Minister, because he rightly says, and something I agree with him on, that having to use a negative SI, for example, during the weekend that everything was happening with Silicon Valley Bank, would not have been possible. We needed the government at the time, rightly, and the Bank of England moved during that weekend to reassure the markets, and everything was sorted, really. Well, I say everything was sorted, there was still more to do, but the big decisions were made over the weekend. If the government had to lay an SI in order to give the bank the permission to do that, that would not have been a good scenario. So I think that the honourable gentleman is saying that he's going to back the other amendment, but not this amendment. I'm a bit confused by his position.
Thank you. To be absolutely clear, her and I are, the Minister and I are absolutely as one on that particular point. To have a negative resolution SI, or indeed any SI, would hold up the problem and create a lot of hassle. So that's why, although there's a substantive part of it, which is the MREL bit, that prevents us from being able to support the amendment. So on that amendment we'll be voting against it. It's the other amendment, which is the growth amendment, that we will be supporting. And my apologies to the General. So I hope that's clear.
I thought that's what he was saying, but it's good to get some clarification from the Shadow Minister. So, as I said in my opening, I think I'm not the only one that was a little confused by that. As I said in my opening, we don't support the amendment in the name of the Honourable Gentleman for Woking, but I do understand the intent and the concern that he raised. Now, there are a couple of other issues raised which I have to say slightly go beyond the bounds of this bill, but I'll respond anyway, which is, as he will know, there is a consultation of the Bank of England on the thresholds, on the MREL thresholds. That consultation closed recently, and as he would expect, the Treasury is working very closely with the bank as it looks through the feedback to that consultation. But that is not the substance, that is not in the substance of this bill, but it is a relevant consideration. But I hope that reassures the Honourable Gentleman that we are working closely with the bank on that issue. I think, and I hope, I've addressed the concerns raised by honourable members opposite, but I'm sure that they will rise to tell me if I haven't. I think we'll get on to the amendment on growth and competitiveness in the next stage of the consideration of line by line.
Mr. Coughlin, you wanted to come back?
Thank you, Chair. Given that for the first time in history the Liberal Democrats have been deserted by the Conservative Party, with the Leader Committee, I beg to ask to withdraw the Amendment 3.
Government Amendment 1, proposed to Clause 1 is on the amendment paper. The question is that the amendment be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. Division. Are the whips ready to lock the doors then, please?
Phil Brickle. Phil Brickle? Yeah. Lewis Cocking? Chris Coughlin? No. Mark Garnier?
No.
John Grady?
Aye.
Clive Jones? No. Charlotte Nichols?
Aye.
Ben Obsujecti?
No.
John Pearce?
Aye.
Emma Reynolds?
Aye.
Dr. Jeevan Sander?
Aye.
Blake Stevenson?
No.
Dan Tomlinson?
Aye.
Christian Wakeford?
Aye.
Imogen Walker?
Aye.
Michael Wheeler?
The ayes were 10, the noes were 6, so the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Unlock. So, we now come to Amendment 4, proposed to Clause 1. I call Clive Jones to move Amendment 4.
I'd like to move amendment number 4, and it is a pleasure to serve under your chairship, Ms Jardine. In what is my first public bill committee, a moment that I suspect no MP actually forgets. Perhaps not. The amendment that I have tabled would introduce a secondary objective for the Bank of England. This objective requires the bank to consider market competitiveness and growth before directing the recapitalisation of failing small banks via a levy on the banking sector. It would seek to address a few existing concerns with the bill. For example, there are no clear limitations on how the Financial Services Compensation Scheme can be used as a source of funds for resolution. This therefore means that there is no time limit on the extra levy imposed by the banking sector to repay the scheme. This amendment would seek to ensure that the Bank of England takes a holistic view of market competition and growth before making a resolution decision. It would therefore provide a strategy to reduce risk and to protect the sector broadly. If the Bank of England determines that not issuing the mechanism could threaten market stability, the amendment would direct them towards resolution. In conclusion, the amendment seeks to support market growth while ensuring that the financial burden on the banking sector remains fair and proportionate. It encourages a measured approach to financial resolution that protects both small banks and broader financial stability. I urge the government to take it on board when progressing the bill.
Thank you. Amendment 4, proposed to Clause 1 as on the amendment paper. The question is that the amendment be made. Minister?
Thank you very much, Ms Jordan. Growth and competitiveness are, of course, fundamental priorities of this government.
Order. Order. There is a division in the House, and so I am suspending the committee for 15 minutes. We will reconvene at 14:48. Thank you.
I think this is such a metaphor.
We'll now resume Amendment 4, proposed Clause 1 is on the amendment paper, and I call the Minister to resume.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll repeat the first part of my speech because we've just been interrupted. Growth and competitiveness are of course fundamental priorities for this government. Financial and economic stability are essential for growth and lie at the heart of this bill. Risks to financial stability arising from bank failures and the disruption they cause to continuity of critical services can be seriously detrimental to growth and competitiveness. It is an obvious point, but one of the principal ways in which the authorities can impact economic growth is by maintaining financial stability. So I turn to Amendment 4, tabled by the Honourable Member for Wokingham. This amendment seeks to ensure that the Bank of England considers competitiveness and growth when using the new mechanism in this bill. It does this by introducing a new objective that the Bank of England would need to consider alongside the special resolution objectives. This objective would be to facilitate the international competitiveness and growth of the UK economy, subject to aligning with relevant international standards. The reason that the government is resisting this amendment is because we believe that whilst well-intentioned, it may have profound consequences. I should start by noting that the aim of the bill is to enhance the resolution regime, but in a way that avoids making more fundamental changes to the regime and the way in which the Bank of England exercises its resolution powers. As I was saying to the Honourable Member previously, this is more of a significant tweak rather than an overhaul, certainly not an overhaul. This is because the government considers that broadly the regime already works well, as demonstrated by the successful resolution of the Silicon Valley Bank UK. The government believes that attaching a new objective such as this to the use of the mechanism in the bill could complicate matters for the Bank of England in using the mechanism alongside its stabilisation powers, and this is the key argument. We know that when managing a firm failure, the Bank of England may need to take a decision at pace in a highly complex and uncertain environment. This is distinct from the regular policy making of the PRA and the FCA, who of course do have a secondary growth and competitiveness objective for which there is cross-party support, but one that is applicable in the context of their general rule-making and policy-making roles. It would be quite different to say that this objective should apply to the Bank of England when taking urgent crisis management action in relation to an individual distressed or failing firm. That reflects the different nature of the decisions the regulators take compared to the resolution authority, which has to act quickly and decisively in a crisis. It's therefore important that the Bank of England, as resolution authority, has a clear and unambiguous basis on which to make such decisions. The government believes that the special resolution objectives already provide this. As members will appreciate, it's important to strike the right balance between ensuring the Bank of England can respond quickly and flexibly to a firm failure and that any impacts on growth and competitiveness are properly considered. The government believes the existing framework strikes the right balance. I would add that the question around how the Bank of England and others support growth and competitiveness is a complex matter and is not one that the bill believes should be or can be addressed in this bill. I hope I've provided a helpful explanation of the government's view on this issue, and I respectfully ask that the Honourable Member withdraw his amendment.
I'll call Clive Jones again, and if I could ask him to address in his remarks whether or not he will be withdrawing the amendment or pressing ahead. Okay.
I will be very quick with my remarks, Ms Jardine, and I beg to withdraw the amendment.
Is everyone content for the amendment to be withdrawn? Amendment by leave withdrawn. We'll move on now to Clause 1 as amended stand part of the bill, with which it will be convenient to debate Clause 4? Yep. The question is that Clause 1 as amended stand part of the bill. The Minister.
Thank you very much, Chair. As we have already discussed in considering Government Amendment 1 and the Amendments 3 and 4, Clauses 1 and 4 of this bill introduce the recapitalisation payment mechanism that is the core of this bill. Clause 1 inserts a new section into the Financial Services and Markets Act 2000, which will allow the Bank of England to use funds provided by the Financial Services Compensation Scheme to cover certain costs associated with resolving a failing banking institution. This new section also allows the Financial Services Compensation Scheme to levy the banking sector to recover such funds. Finally, this new section requires the Bank of England to consult the Financial Services Compensation Scheme before requesting funds and specifies the type of firms in the scope of the bill. Clause 1, therefore, gives the Bank of England the necessary power to protect taxpayers from risk when certain banking institutions fail. In turn, this will allow the Bank of England to protect financial stability, which of course supports the government's top priority of growth by strengthening our economic stability. As has already been debated, this clause has been amended to remove a limitation on the scope of the mechanism introduced in the other place. The government is of the firm belief that whilst this mechanism is not intended to be used for large banks, the unpredictable nature of bank failures warrants appropriate flexibility for the Bank of England to ensure taxpayers and financial stability continue to be comprehensively protected. Turning briefly to Clause 4, this clause sets out that the Bank of England must reimburse the Financial Services Compensation Scheme for any funds the latter provided that are not needed to cover the relevant costs of resolving an institution. This includes funds that were not required either because the costs and expenses were lower than the Bank of England expected or because the Bank of England recovered some funds during the resolution, for example through the sale of the institution. This will provide clarity surrounding how excess and recovered funds should be dealt with and provides a mechanism for ensuring the Financial Services Compensation Scheme does not contribute more than is necessary in support of the resolution. This is important to ensure that the mechanism works as intended and that there is a process for returning funds to industry where possible. Together, both clauses 1 and 4 form the backbone of this bill and put the mechanism in place to further protect taxpayers from risk. I therefore commend both of these clauses as they now stand to the committee.
Yeah.
Thank you. The question is that Clause 1 stand part of the bill, as many as... Oh, and Clause 4. Does anybody... Anyone wish to debate Clause 4? Sorry. The question is that Clause 1 as amended stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to Clause 2, with which it will be convenient to debate Clauses 3 and 5. The question is that Clause 2 stand part of the bill. Minister.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Clauses 2, 3 and 5 in this bill relate to the reporting and accountability requirements on the Bank of England when it uses the recapitalisation mechanism. The government added these clauses to the bill in the other place, reflecting the understandable concerns raised about how the Bank of England will be held to account when using the new mechanism. Together they aim to ensure there is effective transparency and scrutiny when the mechanism is used, helping to provide important assurances following a resolution to the Chancellor, Parliament, industry and the public. Clause 2 requires the Bank of England to report to the Chancellor following its use of the mechanism. These reports must relate both to the exercise of the mechanism and the stabilisation option it is used in connection with. The final report produced by the Bank of England is intended to be a comprehensive account of the use of the mechanism, with the content and timing of the report to be specified by the Treasury. As alluded to in the published draft updates to its Code of Practice, the government expects such final reports to include a number of important points. First, an explanation of the choice to use the new mechanism. Second, how the resolution conditions and objectives were considered and had regard to. Third, an assessment of the costs of using the mechanism compared to placing the firm into insolvency instead. And finally, an explanation of why any ancillary costs were considered reasonable and necessary. Clause 2 also requires the Bank of England to produce an interim report within 3 months of using the mechanism, if the final report has not been provided within that period. This guarantees scrutiny of the Bank of England's action takes place in short order. This guarantees that scrutiny of the Bank of England's actions takes place in short order after a resolution involving the mechanism. For any reports, the Chancellor would be required to lay reports in Parliament, ensuring that there is appropriate transparency and accountability regarding the use of the mechanism. The Chancellor will, however, have the discretion to omit certain information from such reports when they are published, if doing so is deemed to be in the public interest. For example, if reports contain commercially confidential information, or if disclosure could potentially frustrate an ongoing resolution process. Turning to Clause 3, this clause requires the Bank of England to notify the chairs of the Treasury Committee of this House and the Financial Services Regulation Committee of the other place as soon as reasonably practicable after the recapitalisation mechanism has been used. This means that Parliament will be engaged promptly following use of the mechanism. Finally, Clause 5 requires the Government's Code of Practice, which sets out how the resolution regime is expected to work in practice, to include guidance on the contents of the reports of the Bank of England, which is required to produce under Clause 2. This clause places an important obligation on the Treasury to ensure that there is transparency over what the Bank of England should expect to include in such reports. At this point, I would note that the Government published draft updates to the Code of Practice, which set out the sorts of things that are expected to be included in reports by the Bank of England. For example, reports would be expected to include an explanation of the choice to use the recapitalisation mechanism and an assessment of costs of using the mechanism compared to putting the failing firm into insolvency. The Government will issue a full update to the Code of Conduct in line with the provisions in the bill coming into force. As mentioned at the start, these clauses provide important clarity for the Bank of England, industry and Parliament on the accountability mechanisms that apply when the recapitalisation mechanism is used. I therefore commend clauses 2, 3 and 5 to the committee.
Thank you. Mr. Garnier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jordan. I'll be very brief because I don't want to take up too much time with the committee. Just to reiterate the point that this is an incredibly important part of it. Accountability of the Bank of England and the Treasury to Parliament is absolutely crucial. And having had the experience of spending all of my 5 years when I first arrived here in Parliament scrutinising exactly this sector, the more information Parliament has when it's making legislation, the better it is for us all in order to get good legislation. And I have to say that what we brought about in 2016, 2017 seems to have withstood the test of time over the years. But in the event of this mechanism being used in the future, we absolutely have to understand how it's worked and where it's gone wrong and where it's gone well. So we wholeheartedly agree that this reporting requirement is incredibly important. And I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. The question is that Clause 2 stand part of the bill. As many are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Clauses 3 to 5 are being debated. With the leave of the committee, I will take the decision on these clauses together. The question is that clauses 3 to 5 stand part of the bill. As many are as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to Clause 6, with which it will be convenient to debate Clause 7, Government Amendment 2 and Clause 8. The question is that Clause 6 stand part of the bill. Minister.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will briefly cover clauses 6, 7 and 8, which cover the more technical aspects of the bill. Clause 6 makes amendments to the Financial Services and Markets Act 2000. The clause ensures that where the Financial Services Compensation Scheme makes a recapitalisation payment to the Bank of England, its ability to levy the banking sector is extended to cover such a payment. This is key to recouping the Financial Services Compensation Scheme's funds, and thus the bill's aim of reducing potential risk to public funds in a resolution. This clause also stipulates that credit unions are exempt from levies for this purpose, which I'm sure honourable members will agree is a sensible and proportionate approach given credit unions are out of scope of the resolution regime. The rest of the clause makes minor amendments to existing legislation. It clarifies that a recapitalisation payment is not classed as a management expense of the Financial Services Compensation Scheme. And it clarifies that payments in connection with recapitalisation funds provided to the Bank of England that are made in error can be levied for, consistent with the approach for the other statutory functions of the Financial Services Compensation Scheme. Moving to Clause 7. This clause makes amendments to the Banking Act 2009. The clause makes explicit that funds provided by the Financial Services Compensation Scheme in resolution in connection with the new mechanism would not count as extraordinary public financial assistance, reflecting that the new mechanism is intended to reduce risk to the kind of public funds described within this definition. The clause allows the Bank of England to take into account the funds provided by the Financial Services Compensation Scheme when calculating the extent to which certain liabilities are bailed in when the Bank of England exercises its bailing tool alongside executing a transfer. Without this, the Bank of England would not be able to consider the funds provided by the Financial Services Compensation Scheme in instances where it exercises its bailing tool. This may mean the Bank of England would have to continue to write down certain liabilities, potentially including uncovered deposits, where doing so could negatively impact and destabilise the continued operation of the failed firm. The clause also gives the Bank of England the express ability to require the failing firm to issue new shares, allowing where Financial Services Compensation Scheme funds to then be used to pay for these shares, thereby injecting the funds into the firm. This will ensure that the Bank of England can move swiftly to recapitalise the failing firm. The clause also ensures that funds provided by the Financial Services Compensation Scheme can be taken into account appropriately when deciding whether sale proceeds or compensation, where the sale proceeds or compensation are due to those who own the firm before it was transferred. This would avoid including value that was contributed by the banking sector in any assessment of the compensation payable to former shareholders and creditors, which would clearly be inappropriate and increase the cost of compensation to taxpayers. Finally, the clause disapplies a requirement for the Bank of England to notify the Treasury as to whether a certain condition for providing financial assistance to a failing firm has been met, otherwise known as the 8% rule. The 8% rule states that resolution financing arrangements may only be used where the shareholders and creditors of the failing institution have made a contribution equal in value to at least 8% of the institution's liabilities. The government has disapplied this requirement in its updates to the Code of Practice, as it is unlikely that the condition could be met for small banks since they won't hold sufficient loss-absorbing resources to reach the threshold. As such, the statutory notification requirement is redundant. Finally, Clause 8 sets out the procedural matters of the bill, which I trust will cause no concern to honourable members. At this point, I should note the government's second amendment, which removes the financial privilege amendment inserted in the other place. This is standard procedure, and I trust honourable members will raise no objections. I hope honourable members agree that these clauses are sensible provisions to ensure the bill works as intended, and as such I commend them to the committee, Madam Chair.
Shadow Minister Garnier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jardine. You'll be delighted my speech will be even shorter than the last one, and I'm sure the whole committee will be. The Minister rightly sort of says a lot of these are sort of procedural type of amendments to do with the delivery of the bill. The one thing I would say there is, can we thank the government for listening to industry over the excluding credit unions from being drawn into this. It is incredibly important that you don't find lots of other people emerging into these sectors suddenly finding themselves being part of a much more complicated area. Absolutely, on the procedural point of the government amendment, we will be supporting that. Again, I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Okay. The question is that Clause 6 stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to the question that Clause 7 stand part of the bill, which has just been debated. The question is that Clause 7 stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Government Amendment 2, Clause 8. We now come to Government Amendment 2, proposed to Clause 8, which has just been debated. Minister, to move forward.
Move formally.
Government Amendment 2, proposed to Clause 8 as on the amendment paper. The question is that the amendment be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to the question that Clause 8 as amended stand part of the bill which has just been debated. The question is that Clause 8 as amended stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The final question I must put is that I do report the bill as amended to the House. Minister?
I do support. I do beg the committee that we should present the report to the House. The bill to the House as amended.
Thank you.
I would wholeheartedly agree. And can I also, Mrs. Jardine, just thank everybody for all the work they've put into this. It's a great pleasure to see so many new members of Parliament and former hedge fund managers, I have to say. It's just terrific. I have spent many occasions joking about being a former investment banker, a hedge fund manager, and now that I'm a politician, I have the hat-trick of the three most unpopular jobs known to humanity. For a next job, I'm going to be a traffic warden. But thank you all for your hard work, and it's we'll push on, I think. Thank you very much.
Minister,
Could I also just take this opportunity to thank the officials of the House and indeed you, Madam Chair, and also Treasury officials who worked so hard on this bill. We still have some stages to go, but it would be an opportune moment to do that. I beg to move that the bill be reported to the House.
thank you. The question is that I do report the bill as amended to the House. As many as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The committee has concluded its work. Order, order.
Committee Room 12.